You're listening to Fanfiction Factory, the show that takes you to parts unknown with familiar faces and familiar places. And now he's probably the only person whose favorite Sonic Adventure character is to call Draco from Gatorbox.
That one's true. That one's true, actually. She is my favorite character. And I catch a lot of flack because people are like, oh, but Draco, you're supposed to tell us what your favorite playable character is. And I'm like, you didn't specify that as part of the question. You didn't tell me I had to pick a playable character. I told you what my favorite character is. Now shut up. Your question's stupid. I could very well just say my favorite character is Chaos. Can't play as him, but he's in the game. But he's not my favorite character because he's just a tentacle fetish waiting to happen. I'm pretty sure there's fan art of that, by the way. I don't need to look it up, but I'm just gonna go out on a limb. I'm just gonna guess. I'm gonna say that exists, and I have pretty high confidence in that. So please don't leave me comments or remarks that confirm or deny this. I really don't want to know. I don't know why I brought it up, but anyways, that's Nintendolt. Everyone, Nintendo, thank you for the intro. I certainly appreciate it. Welcome to Fanfiction Factory. I am Draco from Gatorbox, and in this week's podcast, we're going to be tackling some LGBTQ issues, which means that I'm going to be walking on eggshells. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And don't it feel good? Yeah. So we're gonna go there. We've in the past read stories that dealt with like same-sex relationships. There was that rocket power story from the Cliffhangers episode that dealt with that, and I didn't really, upsell it or get into it because we had 4 other cliffhangers to read in that episode, so they all were just jumbled up. But this episode is devoted just to one story, and it focuses around that kind of stuff. It focuses around queerness, and I figure, we gotta tackle everything on this podcast, so I'm not afraid to go there. Okay, well, maybe I'm a little afraid, but we're gonna be tackling this issue through the vehicle of King of the Hill. So some of you might be able to guess where this is going if you've seen the show. And if that's the case, just hang tight. We're gonna get to the story, but so yeah, this is a King of the Hill story called Bobby's Confession, and it was published July 24th, 2006. And the description just reads, Bobby has a fetish and wonders if he should tell Hank. And I know when we opened this podcast, I said we're not going to read anything pornographic. This is not a pornographic story. It just deals with sexual preferences, I guess, or sexual identity, gender identity. And I feel like that doesn't constitute, reading something outright pornographic. The rocket power story we read was worse than this one by a long shot, because that one actually, went there. This one just talks about gender identity issues. So without stalling any further, here is Bobby's confession. Yep, said Hank, sipping his beer. Yep, said Dale, smoking a cigarette. Mm-hmm, Boomhauer said, panning the area. Yup, Bill said, scratching his bald head. Nothing special happened in Arlen that Saturday afternoon. The men just stood in front of the fence in their alley, unsuccessfully thinking of things to think about. Finally, after standing silently for over an hour, they gave up trying to think of anything to say and just decided to return home and resume their personal lives. Hank walked into the living room and sat down on the sofa and watched the news on television. Nothing new was on TV. It just seemed like an absolutely boring day. Just then, Peggy, Hank's wife, entered the living room. Hank, why are you just sitting there? If you're this bored, why don't you go mow the lawn or paint the house? Peggy asked her husband. Well, I would, but I did all that 2 days ago. I don't need to do that right now, Hank responded. You know what? We need to go out to the Megalomart and buy some groceries, Peggy said. Get Bobby, we're going. Hank then walked into Bobby's bedroom. Bobby, your mother and I are going to the Megalomart to get some groceries. Do you want to tag along? Hank said. Sure, Dad, Bobby said excitedly. He grabbed his wallet and followed Hank and Peggy out to the truck. Bobby wanted to go to the store for some time because there was something he wanted very badly. Hank started the truck and drove the family to Megalomart. Hank and Peggy were standing around in the produce section, but Bobby was bored. He had not come to the store for this. Dad, Bobby said, can I go somewhere else and look around? Well, sure, son, Hank smiled, but be sure to find us when you're done. We'll probably still be here in the produce section. Okay, Dad, I will, Bobby said, running off. He felt very excited. He had never felt so good in his life. He knew what he was looking for. Bobby bolted around the corners and aisles of the Megalomart and eventually found what he was looking for, the women's clothing section. Bobby looked around to make sure nobody was around. To his luck, nobody was. He instantly snatched off a pink tank top and made a mad dash for the dressing room. Bobby took off his dark gray shirt and slipped the tiny tank top over his husky abdomen. Heh, I like this shirt, Bobby said in a strange voice. He posed in several different positions, seeing how he would look. On impulse, Bobby slipped the tank top in his pants pocket. Then he put his old shirt back on and found some pink bikinis. He took one and went back to the dressing room. This time he shed all his clothes off and put them on and felt kinky. Bobby nearly fainted, but he realized that he needed to go back with his parents. He kept the bikini on but slipped his pants and shirt over it. He hoped his parents would not find out. Bobby left the women's changing section feeling very strange. He hurried back to the produce section where he saw Hank and Peggy leaving for one of the cash registers. Hey, Bobby, you're just in time, Hank started, but frowned when he saw a little lump under Bobby's chest. Bobby, what's that under your chest? Hank asked. Oh, I'm wearing an undershirt, Bobby half lied. Oh, okay, son, Hank said. After paying for the items, the Hills headed for the doors to leave the Megalomart. Just as Bobby was about to walk out the door, loud sirens emitted from all directions. Guess you probably saw that one coming. That's the end of Chapter 1. I should have pointed out this is a multi-chapter story. There's actually 5 chapters to it, but they're all relatively short. So now Bobby's officially... The jig is up, so let's see where this goes. 2 security officers went up to Hank. Excuse me, sir, but we'll have to ask to see your merchandise, an officer said. Excuse me, sir, but I can assure you that I have not stolen a god-dang thing. I paid for every item in that shopping cart, Hank said, pointing his finger at the cart. The officers looked over it anyway to make sure everything was paid for. All the items in your cart are clear, the other officer said, but I don't know why the alarm went off. It went off when that fat kid walked through, the first officer said. The Hills and officers looked at Bobby. Did you steal anything, son? Uh-uh, Bobby lied. He started sweating. He knew he was in trouble now. Well, we're going to have to check your person to make sure, the other officer said. He took a scanner and scanned Bobby. Instantly, the siren emitted. Both officers' eyes widened, but their eyes grew even wider when the scanner went off a second time. Okay, son, take your shirt off. Bobby was slow and reluctant to do so, especially with Hank and Peggy watching him. Do you understand me, boy? Take off your shirt. Bobby still didn't move. Bobby, you heard the officer. Take off your dang shirt or I'll give you a big punishment when we get home, Hank said. Bobby, fearing his father, slowly lifted his shirt, knowing the worst was yet to come. Hank, Peggy, and both of the officers looked shocked when seeing Bobby in the dainty bikini top. Bobby! Cried Hank. What the hell is your problem? Take your pants off, son, the first officer said. Bobby took his pants off slowly, revealing the frilly bikini bottom. Boo! Hank yelled. Yeah, you guys were waiting for me to do that. I know you were, so just, you got it. And look at this, the officer said, pulling the pink tank top out of Bobby's pants. It looks like we have a transvestite. Again, Hank yelled, Whoa! So that's the end of Chapter 2. We move on to Chapter 3. Later that night, Hank gave Bobby a stern talking to in his room. Bobby, you're going to explain yourself right now, ordered Hank. I can't believe you were wearing a bikini. Not only that, but you were stealing. I am ashamed of you. Well, Dad, Bobby started looking around his room. I've got something to tell you. I'm listening, Hank said, giving Bobby a hard stare. Bobby was stuck, though. He couldn't just flat out tell Hank that he was a transvestite. Hank would be ashamed of him and probably give him the biggest lecture he'd ever heard. Bobby knew it was wrong, but he just couldn't help himself. He was just so attracted to frilly garments. Nothing, Dad. Never mind, Bobby said. I'll just take any punishment you throw at me. Well, good. I'm glad that's settled, Hank said. Tomorrow you're going to weed out the backyard, and then you're going to do some maintenance up in the attic. Bobby couldn't sleep at all that night. He tossed and turned, still thinking how great he felt in that bikini. He was determined to do it again, but if he did, Hank would never let him hear the end of it. The next morning, the Hills went to Arlen First Methodist Church as they did every Sunday. Bobby sat through Reverend Stroop's long lecture and hoped that it went on for a long time so he could avoid his punishment. Hank, however, wished Reverend Stroop would hurry up because he couldn't wait to punish Bobby. When the Hills returned home, Hank put Bobby to work as he promised. First, Bobby pulled weeds out of the backyard while Hank stood behind him watching him work. Bobby grumbled as he did so. He had better things to do with his time than slay for Hank. He couldn't help himself. He was wild about girls' clothes, and it was just part of his personality. He wanted to get the work over with so he could see about satisfying his fetish. After Bobby was finished weeding the backyard, Hank and he went up to the attic to fix it up. Hank moved everything downstairs so they could work. Hank and Bobby were nailing plywood to the floor to make a walkable floor. They also started working on a partition. Bobby was curious about the attic work. "Dad, what's all this for?" "Well, son," Hank answered, sounding calm for the first time in a while, "Peggy and I have been thinking that someday we might adopt a child, and we just want to fix this room up for that child." "When's that going to be?" Bobby asked. "Who knows, Bobby? It could be tomorrow or 100 years from now. We're not really sure, but we're still thinking about it." Bobby didn't really care about Hank and Peggy's future plans. He just wanted to get his work done. After he was finished constructing the partition in the attic, Hank let him go. "Go straight to your room, mister," Hank said, sounding strict again. Bobby obeyed and went downstairs. He shut the room to his door and locked it. And that wraps up Chapter 3. Like I said, these are really short chapters. Chapter 2 was like nothing. So we move on to Chapter 4. That Sunday night, Bobby creaked his door open to see if Hank and Peggy had gone to bed. He saw that the lights were out, so they apparently had gone to bed. Bobby then opened the window to his room and silently left. He went into the garage and got his bicycle. He got on and started hurrying when, all of a sudden, he spotted Dale giving him a hard stare through his glasses. Dale stood at the end of the driveway. "Bobby, just where do you think you're going?" The store," Bobby asked. "Why?" "Dad wanted me to get groceries." "At 10 o'clock at night?" "Wait a minute, Mr. Gribble. What are you doing up at this time of night?" "Keep an eye on the neighborhood. I'm the neighborhood watchdog. I make sure nothing weird goes on around here. Now get your sorry ass back inside or I'm telling Hank." Bobby got off his bike and gripped Dale's neck in a certain place which caused him to become unconscious. Wow. Dale fell to the ground and Bobby got back on his bike to leave for the Megalomart. When he got there, he immediately went to the women's clothing section. Practically nobody was in the store. The section was all his. "Finally!" Bobby nearly exclaimed. He tore his clothes off and started to freely try on women's clothing. He loved the sensation of it. He tried on skirts, pantyhose, bras, spaghetti strap shirts, lingerie, panties, and high-heel shoes. He left a bunch of clothes laying all over the women's clothing section. Bobby was dressed in a tutu when he suddenly heard someone yell, "Hey!" Bobby shot back and saw that there was an angry security guard. Bobby gasped and ran out of the Megalomart. He got on his bike and left for safety. Bobby didn't know where he could hide, though, so he just decided to go to Bill's house. Bobby then heard sirens behind him, and he looked back, seeing a police car chase him. When Bobby arrived at Bill's house, he dropped his bike and burst through the door of Bill's house. Meanwhile, Bill was in his bedroom, cuddling with the pillow he pretended was his ex-wife, Lenore. "Oh, Lenore, it's so good to have you back," Bill said, nearly squeezing the pillow. But he stopped when he heard Bobby run inside, along with the heavy footsteps and shouts of policemen. Bill entered the living room to see what was going on. Bobby was hiding behind an easy chair. "Come out with your hands up," ordered the policeman. Bobby slowly came from behind the chair and raised his hands. Bill turned to one of the police officers. "What's going on?" Bill asked, worried. "This kid was trying on women's clothing at the Megalomart in public, made a mess, and left without paying for his tutu," the officer explained. "Bobby!" gasped Bill. Just then, Dale burst inside. He had woken up from being unconscious. "Aha! I knew something fishy was going on, and I'm telling Hank." Dale left to go get Hank. Bobby gasped and nearly started to cry. The policeman asked Bobby for his information and asked Bobby for his side of the story. Afterward, Bobby remained silent while the police recorded the information. It wasn't long after that when Dale returned with Hank. "Bobby Hill, explain yourself," Hank demanded. "What has gotten into you? You're wearing girl clothes again? Apparently doing that work didn't get through to you. Maybe a few hours doing community service will set you straight," Hank said. "But first, I must give you a firm talking to." And that's the end of Chapter 4. So we move on to the final chapter, which is Chapter 5, which is a really short chapter. Hank looked at Bobby angrily, waiting for Bobby's response. Bobby knew this was the big moment. Everyone watching him, he knew it would humiliate him, but he had to say it in order to get it off his chest. "Dad, I'm a transvestite," Bobby confessed, bowing his head. "What?" Hank nearly exploded. "Dad, I'm sorry. It's just the way I am. I like wearing women's clothing. It just turns me on. And if you can't accept me for who I am, then I shouldn't be your son," Bobby said. "But Bobby," Hank started, but then looked around him. Everyone was nodding their heads at him. Hank sighed. "All right, fine, Bobby. If that's how you feel, I guess I have no choice but to accept it." Hank wanted to go home and wash his mouth out with soap. Thanks, Dad, Bobby said and hugged Hank. I love you. I love you too, son, and I'll always be proud of you no matter who you are. But don't think I'm happy about your decision, though, Hank said. For the next week, Bobby was sentenced to a week of community service. He had to pick up trash along the freeways and then clean up graffiti on city buildings. He was glad that he revealed his secret to Hank. He couldn't have gone any longer without telling. It would have gotten him in even more trouble. The end. So, you can see why, I mentioned this story kind of delves into queerness. Obviously, in the cartoon, Bobby is not really portrayed as being, I guess, heteronormative is the term for it. So, that's something that Hank always has to struggle with as a father. And that's one of the reasons why I like King of the Hill so much, is because you can tell Hank is a really traditionalist type of person. He's very conservative, but everyone around him is unintentionally kind of liberal, and he has to learn. He learns it. He learns lessons throughout the course of the show just as much as all the other characters do. And that's one of the reasons why I like King of the Hill so much, is why I think it's so well written, is because it deals with topics like that. So I could potentially see, maybe not describing it as a fetish and saying it turns me on, but I could see this being an episode of King of the Hill. So that's why I wanted to showcase it on the podcast, because it sounds like a harebrained idea for an episode. And like I said, I didn't want to make it sound like, so like I said, no offense intended. I'm fully supportive of transvestites and transgendered people. I have no issues with you. I just wanted to read this story because I felt that while strange, it fits the bill of the show pretty well, while still being out there enough for it to be, fan fiction fair. And I think it's pretty well written. I have nothing negative to say about it. I think, Hank learns about his son in the end of the story, and everyone seems accepting of that. But because he still did things he wasn't supposed to and got into trouble at the store, he still had to do community service. I think it's a bit excessive that the cops chased him. Usually they don't care about shoplifting to that degree. Suspension of disbelief for the sake of a story. There are 22 reviews for this story, so let's open them up and take a look. So here's a comment left by somebody that I'm sure will be disagreeable. Dark little story about a boy who's sexually confused. I like it. Okay, well that sets off red flags immediately. Though here's the next part of that sentence. Although transvestites freak me out. Okay. Top 10 things that you should keep to yourself and not say. No offense if you are one. No offense if you aren't one. I don't know. I wish someone would write a story about Hank Hill not being so strict. He gets on my fucking nerves and forces Bobby to listen to lame music. He won't let Bobby be a punk. If I could, I'd be a punk. I'm a bit rebellious myself. That's why I hate how Hank is. I mean, fuck, it's so annoying. I wish that he wouldn't be so strict and that he would be laid back. That would be the best story ever. I mean, that's in his character. His character is to be strict and to be conservative, like I mentioned a second ago. That's one of the reasons why King of the Hill is such a great show, is that Hank is so conservative, but the people around him, for better or worse, are not really. So he has to manage to maintain his own identity while adapting to the people around him. And I feel like that just went way over this person's head. And they obviously are espousing some opinions that are disagreeable, to say the least. So here's another comment from somebody saying, this was very funny. Bobby cross-dressing is definitely something I could see him doing on the show. However, I felt at the end Hank Hill was a bit too open to Bobby's newfound fetish. A very conservative-minded man like Hank would never tolerate that. So that ties in. I mean, this is somebody else who saw how this could be an episode of the show, like I mentioned earlier as well. Although I don't necessarily think Hank would turn it down. I think this would be something that he would have to accept, just in the same ways that, like, he's had to accept other things about his son, knowing that he doesn't have a very masculine son, right? That's kind of an ongoing arc throughout the entire series, is that Bobby is not the most masculine, boy out there. So this would just be one more step in that direction. But again, I think it's weird that they're stressing on referring to it as a fetish. I mean, I know I'm not gonna dive into terminologies and whatnot, but it just seems weird to throw that word around when Bobby is not, of age or whatever. Here's another comment. Needs more. Whoa! But other than that, it's a good story. Whoa! I know you guys are waiting for one of those whenever I was reading the story. I know y'all were expecting at least one. Y'all got two of them. So that was good. That was good. And finally, there's one more comment that says, why am I not surprised by this? Probably because Hank spends his time being so hard on Bobby. No pun intended, but anyway, he made him that way. Amusing story. Now, I don't really particularly think, people talk about nature versus nurture when it comes to people's gender identity and like sexuality. Now, I don't really necessarily agree with the, nature versus nurture discourse out there. I'm of the volition that people are born a certain way. So that's just how they are. They don't, it's not learned behavior. It's just how they identify with. So I think saying Hank Hill being so hard on Bobby is responsible for him, being so unmasculine or being, in this case, being a transvestite in this story, I think is a little bit, I don't know. I think that's going too far. I think that's incorrect. But again, that's just my opinions on it. I feel, pretty strongly that people should be free to do whatever they want to do. Although, I mostly did pick out this story because it had a very silly premise. And obviously, I wanted to feature King of the Hill on this podcast at some point. And I figured that this would be a pretty good vehicle to do so because, like I said, I want to cover all aspects of fan fiction and, doing like gender twisting or, getting into like characters' feelings and emotions and whatnot. That's one of the most popular things that people write about when they do fan fiction, at least a certain slice of the community. So, I like to showcase all aspects of the fandom, or of not of the fandom, but just of fan fiction in general. There's multiple fandoms within fan fiction, but I would just like to showcase little slices of fan fiction fandom throughout this podcast. And like I said, I wanted to do a story that dealt with an LGBTQ matter, and it just seemed absurd enough to do it through the vehicle of King of the Hill, because it felt the most out of place, but at the same time, given, the predilections of the character Bobby, you could reasonably see this being something that happens on the show. There was a lot of comments I didn't read in the comment section, but that's because most of them were like one-line comments saying, LOL, I could see this being an actual episode of the show. So it just goes to show you how, I guess, good of an idea this was and how well it was executed, that the premise of this story feels like an episode of the show that was never made. So I guess, bravo to the author for churning out something that was genuinely enjoyable and relatable to, people who are fans of the show who watch it and who found that fanfic. But we've only got just that one story to feature for this week's podcast. We've just got a short one this week. I know we just came down from a couple of episodes that were both 45 minutes long, so I'm still getting the hang of how long it takes me to read these fanfics, how long they are, per 1,000 words versus how much airtime that translates to. As I'm recording these, I'm kind of getting a feel for that, so I'm learning as I go. So some of these episodes are gonna clock in way under time, and some of them are actually hitting right on the money. So we're getting close to it. We're working towards it, and as we plan these episodes in the future, we'll try to get closer to that 45-minute mark. Not that I want to waste your time with reading, with reading the insane ramblings of people from the internet from 15 years ago, but because the 45-minute mark was my personal goal for podcast episodes. So that's just what I would like to get to. So that's going to do it for Fanfiction Factory this week. thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Means a lot to me. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm glad that I get to share it with the world. I'm glad I get to have my own podcast where all I do is read weird stories and commentate on them and just go through the comments with you guys. It's kind of cathartic in a way. It helps me reconnect with my childhood, because I spent a good portion of my middle school and early into high school life writing fan fiction myself. If you want an example of that, go listen to episode 1 if you haven't already. I've already admitted that one is mine, so I keep everything else anonymous, but I've already admitted that episode 1 is mine, so that we can put that out there, and then I can read the rest of these stories and nobody thinks I'm punching down by reading them and kind of laughing whenever funny things come up. So that's out there. But like I said, I'm very passionate about this subject because it helps me reconnect with a part of my past that, I guess in a way I'm proud of and I don't want to lose. So even though, I'm in my mid-30s, I still want to hang on to those things, because those emotions, those feelings are important to me. So once again, thank you for listening to Fanfiction Factory. I am, of course, Draco from Gatorbox, signing off.
Fanfiction Factory is a production of Gator Company. To support the podcast, please visit patreon.com/Gatorbox to make a pledge today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next journey.